Here we've got a customer that's come all the way from Edinburgh to Bristol in their E46 M3 for our RACP check and report, along with the comprehensive vehicle inspection. Brilliant dedication, and we thought it was so good of them to drive that far and that long that we do a small video of them to thank them for their efforts. So setting off from Edinburgh at 1:30 this morning, and has travelled all the way down and got to us at 8 o'clock in Bristol. An average, depending on what road you take, an average of sort of getting close to 7 hours and approaching sort of nearly 400 miles. And bear in mind, they have to do the return journey in sort of 4 hours time after we've carried out our RACP check and report and comprehensive vehicle inspection in Bristol, and then they're going to do the dedicated drive all the way back up in one go, which is fantastic. So we thought we'd say thank you and also maybe document the process of what we're going to be doing throughout the next 4 hours. Firstly, thank you for bringing your car to us such a long way. I think in terms of UK customers, you have driven the furthest, which is fantastic, so really appreciate that. We're now going to start the video of the RACP, which is a rear axle carrier panel. Check and report, which is where we look at the panel in great detail to see if there's any problems with it in terms of hairline cracks or spot weld failures. As you know, the E46 is unfortunately known for that sort of issue. And the panel is very large, big piece that is underneath the rear car of the car, sort of goes from the left rear wheel all the way over to the right rear wheel. It connects to that boot floor scallop there and then goes all the way to the fuel tank area there. So it's a very large one-piece panel, and you can hardly see any of it because it's completely covered with an axle, heat shields, under trays, exhaust and things like that. But there are some key areas and locations that we know over the years are good indicators to see if there's any problems. So one of those areas is this left rear mounting point. Here's the left rear subframe bush. And around this area you can sometimes find hairline cracks or spot weld problems on the panel, this is the panel here. But first of all, we need to clean some of the mounting point locations because they've got a general road grime and film on them, which just builds up over the years, just like a dirt residue which needs to come off, and then we can check a little bit closer. It does look like there might be some form of a line even in the dirt just above my finger here, and this is the typical location. That might be a crack. We'll find out a little bit more once we clean that panel. So now we're going to have a look at the panel, the RACP, which is now being cleaned in the location next to the left rear subframe mounting point. This is the panel here, and there's the bolt that goes through the subframe into the panel. And I've cleaned an area of dirt off for this location to see if there are any problems in this sort of common location, and I can see what looks to be a hairline crack, which is unfortunate, but it is visual and quite noticeable. Although it's very thin, it's sort of the thickness of a human hair, which is why they get the nickname hairline cracks. And you can see there's some corrosion in it here down by my finger at the bottom, and then travelling up quite a straight small line, and a little bit of corrosion at the end of it where it is as well. And to give you an idea of size, this over here is a spot weld at circle, and that is 6 millimeters wide, so it's a very thin crack, this one here, and it will travel around the corner and go up the vertical face as well. That area is a little bit harder to see, so I'm just going to move the camera into a different position. So there you can see the crack a little bit clearer. What we were looking at is the bottom edge of it, and then it turns sort of 90 degrees and goes up that vertical face, and it does travel quite high. I don't think it's got quite to the top yet, and the top, I mean, is the top of the panel where the reinforcement plates would finish. But so I think it's containable, but there will be other issues because it's quite a decent crack in length. It's well over 100 millimeters. I'd say it's probably nudging on for 150 millimeters, maybe even sort of 6 inches lengthwise. But because of its length, there will be other problems or other areas of concern as well, because the cracks aren't one of the first things that happen. Spot welds are the first failure, once spot welds start breaking and cracking, then the panel has more chance of moving, and then stress cracks occur as a secondary effect. Just to give you an example of a spot weld which has failed, so here's one which is good, it's a perfect circle, another perfect circle, and this one here is broken, and that's what we call a broken spot weld. And it's also got a crack coming out of it as well on this right hand side, and it's trying to give you like a sort of a hook effect. But compare those two spot welds. Oh, actually, now I've zoomed in, I didn't even see this with my eye until I zoomed in, but you can see that that one is starting to crack. It's got like a crescent sort of half moon shape next to it. Compare that to that one there, which is quite normal, doesn't seem to have any great problems with it. But we've got two spot welds which are failing underneath the car, and one crack there. We've also got a spot weld failed on the very left rear corner of the rear axle carrier panel, where it's spot welded to the wheel arch panel. So the spot weld which is failed is just up by that shock absorber. There's a rusty looking sort of circular patch. I'll point it out with my finger just up there. And that's one of the spot welds which has failed and it's now got rust in it, or corrosion's been building up. And that can also be proved by looking round at the other side. This is where the panels meet by the shock absorber, just this lip here, and this is where they're spot welded together at the factory. And there's a big corrosion line all the way through that area, and if you look really closely you can see there's a crack line, and that isn't a crack in the metal, that's a crack in the seam sealer. Where the panel is moving ever so slightly, the sealer is broken, and therefore moisture and water has been able to get into that joint where it's now not sealed correctly, and that's why there's a big corrosion line in that location there. So there are some issues. There's actually, I can just also see a crack at the end of the corrosion line when I look up the sort of the rear, the very last spot weld, which is what we call spot weld 3. This one has got a vertical crack going through it as well, which is coming from the outside on the, just there on the wheel arch panel, and is going inboard onto the rear axle carrier panel. So that also needs addressing as well. That might mean that we've got some cracks behind the heat shield here. Behind this heat shield is a chassis leg, and yeah, there is one crack there. Just zoom in. So it's got like a black sort of sweat around it, which is that location there. That is sort of common signs that the panel is moving and sort of not pulling down. It's got nowhere near that sort of serious yet, but it is flexing, it's seeing fatigue. And you can also see that by another 2 spot welds which have failed up here. And these are very common issues where the panel is connected or spot welded to the internal chassis leg, which is inside the car, the left hand side chassis leg. As we're looking directly up now, if I pan out you can see where we were looking directly vertically up, and this is where the panel is spot welded to the left chassis leg on that spot weld there, and also that spot weld is where it's spot welded to the boot floor panel, which is the boot floor panel going across the back of the car. Those are only accessible from inside the car. Even though you can drill them from underneath, you can't get proper penetrated MIG welds overhead because of all the sound deadening and the seam sealer directly stuck to the panel above. So small amounts of that has to come off inside the car to accurately repair that. That is an area which is close to the reinforcement plates, but nobody's reinforcement plate covers that because it's just not part of a reinforcing mount location like this one here. So that's an area that also needs additional work, which needs work inside the car. And probably there'll be some form of spot weld failed in the corner down that location. Yeah, it's not very obvious, so that one either hasn't failed yet or isn't showing signs of breakage on the seam sealer, but there's a common one down in the corner in line of that one there, which sometimes crack, but may not have done on this one. Similar thing on that one, there's the same one on the right hand side, the opposite side, which does look to have cracked because it's got a corrosion marker in it in the middle of nowhere, and also there's a line going around it, and if you look closely it is sort of a semicircle line, and that is a definite crack and a broken spot weld in that location there. So that's near the right rear spring mount, and that's a 3-layer panel connection. That's holding the rear axle carrier panel to the right chassis leg and also the seat panel, the top of the seat panel, the rear seats. So that one needs some work and attention as well. And then looking at the right rear mounting point, now this one gets away a little bit easier, it has a little bit of an easier life, but there is still a hairline crack. I haven't cleaned this one off yet, but you can see it in the dirt. see if I can point it out to you. It starts, right, it's about there, and then goes up and then along that way up there. So it's not very long, probably 60 millimeters in length, but there is a hairline crack on the right hand side as well, which is a mirrored image of the fold in the RACP where these ones crack. It's in the same location of that one as well. So that also is going to need some work. And then the right front mounting point, this one is even easier to see. We don't need to do any lowering of the axle or anything like that because the crack is very obvious. Behind this handbrake cable, which I'm moving now, if you keep an eye on the handbrake cable in the distance, just over there, there's a black line, which is the crack. And I'm going to zoom in and try and focus on that panel so that you can see that. And when I move the handbrake cable down, you can see that even clearer. And there are multiple cracks. It's hard to get the camera to understand that, but I've seen with my own eyes there are several cracks in that location, and they're not only on top of the bush area, they've actually come out of that location and they're now travelling up a vertical face. So they've been there for some time and they are growing. So that will also need attending to, but that's perfect time to do that all in one go, because you wouldn't do the left rear mounting points without doing the front, for example. It would all be done as one big package. So that shows you the underside of the RACP and what we're looking at and how many cracks are present and spot welds as well. But there is also another side to the RACP. There's the internal side, which is only noticeable inside the car. So we're now going to go inside the car and take some pieces out, rear seats and boot floor carpets, so that we can inspect the other side of this panel, especially where these spot welds are in the boot, to see if there are any problems. So now we're inside the car, starting to take out the internals, and we've taken out the seat backrests, and now we're just lifting out the seat base rest, or the base seat section. We need to get all this out so that we can access the front section of the rear axle carrier panel. So now the interior's out, we need to remove some redundant brackets which aren't used on the coupe models, and then drill a 20mm hole in the rear seat panel. We know exactly where to drill to get us access to the tops of the rear axle carrier panel front pair of mounts where the MIG welds are, and that's what we're doing now. So once this the swarf has been cleaned up and we've painted the area with a black primer so that there's no bare metal, then we can get inspecting the inside with a bore scope camera. So we're now in the boot of the car and we've taken out the carpet section and also the rear seat area. You saw us preparing that earlier in the video where we were taking the brackets off and drilling the 20mm holes for access. Well, we'll go and look at that later, but we're going to start in the boot area, and we've got the various grommets out of the boot location. BMW kindly put grommets and various holes in the boot around the rear axle carrier panel mounting points. It's almost as if they knew these areas would need inspecting or something in the future. So these areas are exposed now, the grommets are taken out, and we're going to use this item, which is a bore scope camera connected to the laptop, to access inside those areas and see if there's any problems. So first one is we're going to go on the right hand side. Right hand side hardly ever gets any issues. I can't remember the last time I saw an issue on the right hand side, but we're going to go in there anyway, always check everything. And the first area I want to show is this spot weld, which is a 3-layer spot weld connection. Now this one is very good, there's no problems with this. It's the same e-coat colour as the panel surrounding it. There's no black lines, there's no wax content stuck around it, there's no rust. So it's quite a normal looking spot weld. Now keep that in mind, and now we'll go over to the left hand side, the same area, to look at the mirrored image of that spot weld. And you can now see clearly how that one's quite different. It's got a very strong black line all the way around it. It's got like a rust looking colour here and here, and also it's got cracks coming out of the spot weld there and there. Now both of those cracks have been there for a while because they've dead-ended themselves on the edge of that panel. That's what we call the rib panel. That rib panel is what's got these veins and rib sections in it. That's holding 3 pieces of metal together. It's holding the rear axle carrier panel, which you can just see up there, and then from here downwards you've got the cavity cover panel, and then this is the rib panel. So it's 3 layers of metal hold together, but they're not anymore. Well, certainly not, the rib is not connected anymore. So some people can get squeaks and creaks and metallic sort of clicking noises from this problem. When spot welds break, you've got metal which is contracting and flicking and vibrating together. So that one there definitely needs some work, and as you can see, it's not accessible underneath the car, it's only accessible inside the car, and not even easily inside the car because it's hidden underneath this rear boot floor panel section. So the other area we need to look at is through this hole here, and down in here we've got a panel joint area where the cavity cover panel, which is what we saw up there just now, finishes, and there's the edge of the panel here, and that's where it's spot welded to this piece, which is the rear axle carrier panel. Now there's a spot weld there, but I can see that one looks very good. It's all the same colour all the way around. There's no black lines or anything cracked or rust in it. But then the other spot weld over to the right does have some issues with it. You see it's got that typical black sort of waxy looking line that we looked at earlier on the video just now in this location. Now that's the same thing. So the spot weld is, we're looking at on a sort of a perspective angle, so it's an oval looking spot weld, and from there to there the spot weld hasn't cracked, but from there going round the vac and then coming out this way we've got a crack, and that crack hasn't yet finished growing. It's still travelling and it's trying to get to the end of that panel, the path of least resistance. But there is a risk that the other end here could crack, and although it's likely to travel over here as well, sometimes you see the cracks going that way and then they climb eventually up this vertical face. So it's not something that wants to be ignored. It needs to be thought about. Even though it's perfectly safe to drive still, it would be wise to put this into the future plans of the car, now knowing what you know about the rear axle carrier panel on this vehicle. So that's some issues inside in that location, and now we're going to look inside the car in the front section. So for this we need to take out the rear seats, which we did previously, and you saw us just now drilling the hole for the access panels, in the seat panel, sorry, to access the tops of the rear axle carrier panel. So this is the top of the rear axle carrier panel, and this area here is where we saw some spot welds underneath the car. This is the sound deadening I was talking about that would have to come off to repair those two spot welds properly. And then the rear axle carrier panel front pair of mounts are actually beneath the seat panel, which is this item here. The seat panel join is there, and then it sort of sculpts round, which is where the rear passengers would sit. And so we've taken the brackets off that aren't needed. They're only on touring and saloon models, and we've drilled a 20mm hole exactly where we need to visually look then at the MIG welds. There's a pair of MIG welds which are holding two panels together, and sometimes they crack. We've painted the areas black with a fast drying primer, so there's no bare metal. We've taken out the swarf from the location with a magnet, and also we'll be putting a 20mm BMW grommet in, one of these ones that goes in these factory locations, to close the panel off so it's sort of back to how we found it, and also that does serve as a good purpose for future inspections. So in here we don't really need the borescope camera because we can see that there are cracks on the MIG weld. So the MIG weld is under my finger just now, and now it's visible. MIG weld is sort of a weld which is about 1 inch long. Some people call them stitch welds, and they're holding two pieces of metal together. And we can see there is a crack on the left hand side of that MIG weld, just underneath my glove now, and then also travelling up, and very small. It's probably in length only 15mm long, but it's there and it's present. And down on the bottom I can't see anything coming out of the bottom MIG weld, and on the other side the MIG weld, at the moment that one looks okay. Now moving over to the driver's side, this one's a bit more obvious, and this one is quite common. The right hand side gets quite a lot of abuse, and then this is the mount gets quite a lot of abuse, but this is the one that underneath we saw quite a few cracks when we moved the handbrake cable out of the way, and now this is the top of that mount. And that MIG weld is always much more penetrated on this side. BMW sort of knew that this one was going to be the problematic side, so they strengthened it, not strengthened it, but they applied MIG welds a lot better and more penetrated than these ones. You see the gaps on this side where they always are missed, but on the right hand side they've got much better penetrating MIG welds. But this one is definitely cracked. We've got a crack sort of going, the MIG weld I should say is under my glove now, and now it's visible, and it's going across the MIG weld and then also up the top. It's not very long, certainly not as long as the ones underneath the car, but it's present, and I would say that's probably 40mm long in length. But it does look like that section of the MIG weld has also got a crack. At the bottom of the screen now, you can see that jagged black line down here. That is the crack continuing, so it's not just going that way, it's also going off the bottom of the screen, which is coming towards the front of the car. So yeah, in actual fact, it's probably a good 80mm long, because it's probably as long as it is down that side than it is up on the top section. And also there's another MIG weld over in the distance, just over there, and that one's got some black lines through it as well, which are crack lines. They don't appear to be growing into the panel, but they are cracked around the MIG weld, which is clear to see. So there is a section, or an argument there, to say that a section of the MIG weld is actually loose now, so that can also cause noises, clicking noises on load take up, metallic sort of weird tinging noises sometimes once they get really loose, especially if that MIG weld was to completely crack around it and leave a section separate to the top cavity cover panel. So that is an area of great interest that lots of people don't tend to know about, or didn't know about many years ago, but through lots of our research and sort of development phases of our repair and reinforcement process, we've been doing these for a very long time, good 5 years for the internal sections, and probably overall, well, since 2011 we started doing this repair and sort of developed a process for it. So that now gives you a clear understanding of the RACP and what problems we found with it that are unfortunately there. The inside work inside the car is quite a lot more than the underside of the car, and although they should be done at a similar time, for the reason being that directly underneath these two mounts and underneath this area here is the plastic fuel tank, and there's no way you'd want to do any sort of welding here, because there are routings or cavity gaps where weld balls can fall down, and they would land directly on the plastic fuel tank. So the fuel tank has to come out of the car just to do these ones, but that would happen anyway if you were doing the underside of the car, so it makes sense to do it all at the same time. The underside repair is quite straightforward. Ourselves and lots of other people that do them nowadays do that all day long, whereas the inside is a lot different. Not many people do the inside. We do it very regularly, but it's a huge amount of work, because we've got obviously lots of flammable material in here, lots of delicate leathers, lots of irreplaceable items, or not very easily replaced items like bonded rear glass and things like that, and you think about the process that has to happen to repair the insides of the car. So we have to cut open a section here, so that's cutting, then we have to do drilling, welding, painting, spraying, waxing, so lots of items like that which create a huge amount of atmospheric fallout. And when you're doing that underneath the car, that's fine, because it just falls to the ground under gravity, but when you're inside the car, all that is flung about and can cause issues. So the car has to be hugely stripped down, so that's carpets out, rear door cards out, leather seats out, boot carpets, headrests, rear bolsters. Then we have specially designed cardboard templates which are very thick, which are cut to size for the rear windows and the rear screen. That all has to be taken into account, and the headlining is completely covered and protected. Center console has to come out, and then we partition off the front of the car so that we don't get any sort of working issues down over to the front of the car. All of our sort of work carries on from sort of like the handbrake area backwards. So that takes a lot of time. That's many hours worth of stripping and preparing the car. Then we can actually carry out the work, and then we can then sort of demask and put the car back together internally. So it's a big job. We charge 6 hours labour to do the inside of the car, the front mounts there and there. But bear in mind, on this car there's also a couple of issues which we're going to need to take some sound deadening material off to deal with these two spot welds properly. And I'd argue at the time of the sound deadening off, I'd suggest and recommend that people have stitch welding, where it holds the rear axle carrier panel to the chassis leg here, because that just shores that area up and means that it's not relying solely on spot welds anymore. Then you've got MIG or stitch welding, and normally you'd probably double that up, do it on the right hand side as well. You wouldn't want to leave one side unnecessarily weaker than the other. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of what we found with the RACP internal sections and the underside sections. We'll finish up by having a good look round the other areas, the rear seat upright strut area, where there's a MIG weld down there and there that sometimes suffer, and we'll also check down through the seat panels here and also under the ISOFIX mounts, because there can be other cracks. If we find cracks, we add them to the video. If there are none, then that's the end of the process there. So I've had a look around at the other areas now, and the only thing to point out is where I talked about the two spot welds underneath the car here and here, which have started to break and the panel has started to move. That can now clearly be seen. Now we've got lifting on the boot floor side carpet. Now some people will argue that this sort of line or squashed line here is due to the carpet resting in there, which is quite possible, but in certain lights you can see a little bit of corrosion and a separation between this panel, which is the rear axle carrier panel, and this panel, which is the chassis leg. Just about now, I mean, it's going to be hard for people that don't look at this regularly to understand what we're looking at, but this, take it from me, that this is separation of the rear axle carrier panel. You can see like a yellow cream line going down there, which is the edge of the seam sealer, where the seam sealer has been pulled apart, and there is actually a gap. Not an air gap or where water can get in, but there is a definite separation line in this left rear corner of the RACP where it's connected to the chassis leg. So now the RACP work, or the check and report is finished, now we can move on to what we call the comprehensive vehicle inspection, which is something we've been doing for years on the E46s, so we know them extremely well. And it's a highly detailed report of the underside and mechanical workings of the car, where a technician will spend on average about 1.5 hours studying the underside. And I don't say that lightly, that is very detailed, attention to detail, sort of a keen eye on components to see what is actually faulty now, which of a car of an age does have some things like oil leaks, for instance here. So things like that will obviously make the report, but even things that are very small and minor that most people wouldn't really think about, or possible most companies wouldn't even notice, like the exhaust downpipe joint, the nut and bolt arrangement is the wrong way round. The Torx headed bolt should be on this side, and the nuts, which are also incorrect, they should be 14mm copper coated nuts, should be on that side. And then very small little funny things, even if there's an early signs of a diff oil leak here starting, obviously makes the report, but then right down to what some people might find picky, but it's more about getting the car back to an original standard. Most people would love to have the car in a sort of as good condition as it left the factory. For instance, these ABS and brake pipe wiring is routed incorrectly around the trailing arm. It's close or at risk of being close to the tyre. It should go round this side. There's the clipping point for it there. Also, we've got things like the V-brace underneath the car. It's got the incorrect bolts on it, and although they're holding on and doing the job perfectly fine, we can tell from experience that these bolts with the flanged head and then also a washer are actually for the front reinforcement under tray. These ones here, whereas these bolts for the V-brace should just be normal hex head bolts with a separate washer, not a flanged head bolt. So if people really would love to get the car to a great condition, then this is the place to come to have a very in-depth report carried out of the vehicle, where we'll also include any internal items inside the car. If the mirror is leaking or if there's problems electrically that we notice, we will advise on all those items and then produce a highly detailed report. A video, sorry. Now the video obviously is a personal one to the owner and each owner, and so I'm not going to include that in this documentary. This is more of an example of what we do, but I'll now shortly be spending time to work through the report, and then I'll video each individual item so that the owner will see exactly what we are reporting to them, rather than just reading it on a list on a paperwork. They'll be able to watch a video which usually lasts for around about 30 minutes with myself narrating and showing each individual item and talking about the process, so that they can understand exactly the condition of their E46 M3. So then the items are written up onto a report as we find them, so that we don't forget anything. And although it looks like a scary list and there's lots of things here, remember lots of these are very minor items to make the car very original again, and not necessarily items that are failed right at the moment. And we split that down to underneath the car, engine bay, then the RACP checks, and then also later on it will be anything on the interior and things like that. and then that is presented to the owner on an advisory report basis. And that extends to the engine bay checks as well. So we're very thorough in what we'll be looking for to try and work out if there's any items that have failed now, or leaking, or about to come up in the future that the owner could be alerted to, just to sort of save them some time. And it can boil down to even very, very small things like the caps here are incorrect. These caps here should be on the turret here to match this one, and the strut brace nuts don't have anything on. Things like we've noticed on the e-box, the little bracket that holds the brake servo pipe is loose because the bolt isn't secured down correctly. There's a grommet missing from that location down there in that rain channel. There's some non-genuine wiring down on this side and PVC tape, and then it matches to fabric tape, which is incorrect. How that plug doubles back on itself, and then is cable tied up there. Just a few little things that most people wouldn't notice, and to be honest aren't that important, but we're so OEM and original that we like to point out things that aren't really being picky on the car, but they're just sort of helping the owner identify problem areas that can be improved to make the car as original as possible. Like that pollen filter housing there, just spotted that spring clip isn't seating down, it's sat up and it won't clip back in. So it just needs reseating, a bit of moving and jiggling, and that should reseat itself hopefully. Or if it doesn't, then that can go down on the report as well. So that's the car completed and work finished on this E46 M3, the RACP check and report. The interior is all back together, and the report has been written up. And I got it wrong before. I said the customer had travelled from Edinburgh, but I was actually wrong. It was Glasgow. So again, thank you very much to our customer who's driven all this way to us in Bristol, and is literally turning around and going all the way back home 4 hours later. So it's another near 8-hour drive, something like 400 miles, which is just remarkable. Probably gets the record for the longest trip made in the UK to us at Redish Motorsport, and we're looking forward to working with him again. So if you've got an E46 or an M3, anything CS, CSL that you need some thorough detailed inspections on, whether it be RACP checks or just a comprehensive vehicle inspection, a post-purchase or a pre-purchase inspection, give us a call at Redish Motorsport and we'll be happy to help you.